Welcome everyone to the closing session for OCIS 2020. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the first Australians from whose traditional lands I speak today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. My name is Professor Ben Goldsmith. I'm Deputy Chair of the conference hosted by the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. I would like to briefly thank the chair, Professor Toni Erskine, my deputy co-chair, my co-deputy chair, Professor Evelyn Goh, and all the members of the organizing committee, as well as Michelle Ferreira and the entire support team at the Coral Bell School for all of their work in making OCIS 2020 a really big success. Before I introduce our closing keynote speaker, I'd like to turn to the inaugural PhD Paper Prize and inaugural Oceanic Book Prize. For the PhD paper, I would like to thank the other members of the committee, Associate Professor David Capey of Victoria University, Wellington in New Zealand, Dr. Michael Cohen of the ANU, and Dr. Amy King also at ANU. The winner of the PhD paper prize is Ashraful Azad, a PhD candidate at UNSW Sydney, for the paper Maritime Migration of Rohingya and Responses of the States. This paper contains an impressive and extensive empirical field research that sheds new light on the maritime migration process of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, and it develops a better understanding of the response of states towards that migration. Ashraful will receive $500 for the prize, thanks to the sponsorship of the journal Australian Foreign Affairs. Now I will hand over to Professor Paul Kenny, who will award the book prize.
Thank you. So this year in 2020, the OCIS Organizing Committee decided to inaugurate a new prize in recognition of the excellent work being done by scholars in our region on international studies. So the new Oceania Book Prize in International Studies is awarded to the best book published in the previous 2 years by a scholar based in our region. We saw contributions that were excellent in terms of theoretical originality and or empirical rigor. The award committee comprised myself, Alexander Debs of Yale University, and Emma Hutchison of University of Queensland. And I'd like to thank both of them for their hard work on this committee. We read many excellent entries and found the best of them very tough to separate. And as a result, in addition to selecting a winner, we also selected 2 books for an honorable mention. These are Saving Soldiers or Civilians, Casualty Aversion versus Civilian Protection in Asymmetric Conflicts by Sebastian Kempf of the University of Queensland. And that book is published with Cambridge University Press in 2018. The second book for an honorable mention is Violating Peace, Sex, Aid, and Peacekeeping by La Trobe's Jasmine Westendorf. And that's published with Cornell this year in 2020. Congratulations to both of them on their excellent work. The winner of the $1,000 prize, which is sponsored by the Australian Institute for International Affairs, is The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria by Dara Conduit of Deakin University. The award committee felt that this book makes several seminal contributions to the field of international studies. These are to the dynamics of the Syrian uprising, both historically and in its contemporary form, to the issue of Islamist party politics, and to questions of political mobilization under authoritarian rule. Drawing on a wide range of evidence, we felt that the book was really tightly argued and very lucidly written. It's accessible to policymakers, to academics, and to students. We highly recommend it. We feel that it advances our understanding of complex country and a complex region and its contentious politics. So congratulations, Dara, on this superb achievement. I'd now like to ask her to say a couple of words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, and to the OCIS book community who would have had an absolutely monstrous time choosing between all those wonderful books. So thank you so much, for choosing me. This book has had a long genesis. It's the product of my PhD, and I started writing it at a time when the Muslim Brotherhood was sort of viewed to be rising, particularly in Syria, and it was thought to be a key player and the obvious inheritor of power in the country. And it was quite clear after I started writing that that just didn't happen. And so that's, I guess, what I was trying to look at. It was such a privilege to be able to write this book, and I met so many brilliant Syrians in the process. Some who were members of the Muslim Brotherhood and were frustrated by the group and its failure to change with the times, but also many people on the outside. And I guess by the time I got to the end of this book, I was left with this sense of bitter disappointment that the brave and the principled Syrians who rose up against despotism in 2011 got neither the government nor the oppositions that they so dearly deserved. And so I guess I have so many people that I should thank for their immense contribution to this book as proofreaders or advisors or as members of my cheer squad. But since I'm short on time, I'd mostly like to thank all of my participants who were just so incredibly generous with their time and stories, and who, without this, the book would certainly not have existed. So thank you so much to you all.
Great. Thanks to, congratulations to the winners of both of the prizes from me as well. I'd now like to introduce the speaker, Professor Bina D'Costa, who will deliver the OCIS 2020 closing keynote address. Bina is a professor in the Department of International Relations at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at ANU. She was also the inaugural Associate Dean for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access at the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific. Her publications include Nation Building, Gender and War Crimes in South Asia in 2011, Children in the Politics of Violence, 2017, and Cascades of Violence, co-authored with John Braithwaite in 2018. Bina has worked as a senior UN staff member, most recently at UNICEF to build its migration and displacement program at the Office of Research Innocenti. As a frontline researcher and a humanitarian practitioner, she has contributed to Europe's and the Horn of Africa's refugee emergencies and served in the UN Rohingya Emergency Response Team in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. She has provided inputs and technical advice to transitional justice processes, including witness protection and victim support mechanisms at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, International Crimes Tribunal Bangladesh, and civil society transitional justice initiatives in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Cambodia. Bina's talk today is titled, "Where Exactly Am I Sitting at the Table? Race, Prejudice, and Perpetual Insecurity in International Relations." I'd like to also remind the audience to type their questions into the Q&A function rather than the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Bina, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. This is a huge honor and responsibility bestowed to me by the organizers of the conference. I'm very grateful to Professor Toni Erskine, Professor Ben Goldsmith, and Professor Evelyn Go for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the amazing OCIS organizing committee, especially our communication team, for seamless Zoom sessions. We are very grateful to you. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city, Canberra, where I live and work. I would also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's event. The Reconciliation Action Plan of Australia's higher education inspired universities including the one I belong to, stipulate an acknowledgement to country. This is not only an important reminder of Australia's settler colonial past, but also a crucial step towards genuine reconciliation. This acknowledgement involves respecting the custodians of the land where many of us work and live, and a genuine respect for different ways of knowing and doing through Indigenous learning and traditional knowledge. In May 2020, Rio Tinto, the second largest metal and mining company in the world, destroyed Juukan Gorge, a 46,000-year-old Aboriginal site with sacred old caves. This sparked a global outcry. Subsequent inquiries found that Rio Tinto was given ministerial consent in 2013 to do so. It was acting within the law. It was abiding by Western Australia's Aboriginal Heritage Act 1972 that in Section 18 allows the owner of the land, in this case Rio Tinto, to proceed with development actions subject to ministerial consent. I wept when I read the story. I could only imagine the profound grief and rage that many First Nations people felt. The rituals of perfunctory acknowledgement through our public speech acts and the everyday denial of rights of the First Nations people indicate that our rhetoric of inclusion and the practices of exclusion do not exactly match each other. Yet I always begin with such acknowledgement in the hope that I will leave behind a more inclusive higher education environment in Australia and in the global north than what I first encountered 2 decades ago. In another piece of news that will not make any headlines, even in Bangladesh, the country where this is happening, the Mro community, a tiny Adivasi indigenous group, is protesting against the development of a 5-star Marriott hotel and an amusement park in Nilgiri, Bandarban. This hotel is being planned through a joint development plan with the Bangladesh Army. This proposed development is taking place in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, which, under British colonial law, is a protected zone for indigenous people. Bangladesh does not recognize indigenous people as indigenous. Land grabbing in the name of corporate tourism and ecotourism is quite common in Bangladesh, as it is in other parts of Asia and the Pacific where indigenous people live. The military in Bangladesh has inventive names for its peacebuilding operations, such as Changing Hearts and Minds and Operation Uttaran of Rising Hearts. Land grabs contribute to an increase of the rate of sexual and gender-based violence, as dispossession of land from women leave them dependent on male relatives and more vulnerable to violence and sexual abuse. Acres of indigenous land grabbed by the business sector, especially tobacco companies, the tourism industry, and the security sector, under the pretext of providing better services and improving the livelihood of communities, have also led to women's increased marginalization and vulnerability. Sexual and gender-based violence has often been used to intimidate indigenous people to sell their land at bargain prices. In some cases, the land is resold to military personnel and their families who have accumulated vast wealth in the Chittagong Hill Tracts and invested in the tourism industry, contributing to the cycle of militarization in the region. These land grabs also affect women disproportionately, as they are deprived of the livelihood they earn through small-scale agriculture. Both of these examples show how law, rules, and regulations could be employed to create barriers and perpetuate violence. I offer these two vignettes from Australia and from the Chittagong Hill Tracts to explain the intersection of race, coloniality, gender, and locational politics. Here I pursue this investigation by placing together two frameworks of analysis. The first draws on the scholarship published by women of color in academia and insights from indigenous activists who have employed the concept of intersectionality long before we have seen it named as such. The indigenous women in Australia and in Bangladesh, in their stories, poems, art, and music, and in their academic reflections, have made clear what is violent domination and exploitation of their lands that is carried on women's backs. And I also reflect on my journey from South Asia to Australia. The second is about theorizing global security from the perspective of everyday insecurities and the renewed interest of talking about race following the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and what it means for our discipline. This keynote is a result of several lively conversations I have had with my feminist friends and my colleagues at the Department of IR in the Bell School. Many of these conversations were held in different locations over a period of years. In the spirit of collaboration, it is also important to recognize that these are not just my words that I share with you. They are the product of blood, tears, and utterances that we have collected as part of the wider community. We have them in a bank, and from time to time, in opportunities such as these, we inward, not encash, some of that, so that we can draw attention to the fact that our struggles are far from over. There are many people whose contributions have prepared this ground for someone like me to stand on. Far too many to name, and perhaps exclusionary to name a few. Some we have lost along the way. Teresia Tua, Lily Ling, Maria Lugones, to all my friends and feminist colleagues, a big thank you. I slip between the language of I and we, they and you. I thought of this as a disclaimer, but it is not. While I reflect on my personal experiences, I would also like to think that I myself and other feminist scholars and critical IR scholars are not alone in the academic universe of international relations scholars who are thinking about these things. We belong to a network of people who come from diverse backgrounds and standpoints. Many of us have experiences in other sectors as policymakers, practitioners, and activists. Consequently, throughout this reflection, this slippage in semantics is deliberate. Argentine philosopher Maria Lugones, who passed away in July 2020, reflected on yet another dimension of this semantics of we and you in her writings. Lugones came to the US in 1960 to study and became well known for her political and intellectual work in building coalitions among women of color and grassroots work in popular education outside the academy. In one of her powerful conversational essays with another critical race theorist and feminist philosopher, Elizabeth Spellman, she noted, "When I say we, I'm reflecting to Hispanos. I'm also pained by the tenuousness of this we, given that I'm not a native of the US. Through the years, I have come to be recognized, and I have come to recognize myself more and more firmly as part of this we. I also have a profound yearning for this firmness, since I am a displaced person, and I am conscious of not being of, and I am unwilling to make myself of, even if this were possible, the white Anglo community." She reflects, "We and you do not talk the same language. When we talk to you, we use your language, the language of your experience and of your theories. We try to use it to communicate our world of experience. But since your language and your theories are inadequate in expressing our experiences, we only succeed in communicating our experience of exclusion." Lugones explains what exclusion means and how complaining about exclusion is also a way of remaining silent. Then she continues talking about alienation, which might resonate with some of you. When we see that you feel alienated in your own communities, this confuses us because we think that maybe every feminist has to suffer this alienation. But we see That recognition of your alienation leads many of you to be empowered into the remaking of your culture, while we are paralyzed into a state of displacement with no place to go. For Lugones, this is where theory making could be rethought in terms of friendship as a crucial motivation. This friendship, in a non-imperialist sense, requires that you make a real space for our articulating, interpreting, theorizing, and reflecting about the connections among them. A real space must be a non-core space, and that you follow us into our world out of friendship. Reading her 1983 piece in 2020, I see important departures from her argument. It doesn't answer my discomfort with privileged academic life in South Asia, the IR departments in also Global South. In my work, I have repeatedly emphasized that I do not wish to romanticize the Global South. Here I'm following Douglas and Connell's conceptualization of the Global South as a way of accounting for the geopolitical power relations within which much of global governance occurs. It's of course imperfect, but it does a better job than if we talk about it as third world or developing countries. Countries in the Global South and academics in the Global South also perpetuate colonial forms of prejudice and insecurity. But the alienation that Lugones ponders about of being an outsider-insider in the US in 1983 resonates with me in 2020 in Australia. I carry this sense of alienation back and forth in South Asia, where I come from. I don't feel quite at home there. I don't feel quite at home here. I don't feel comfortable by just being from one country. Yet my passport makes me from somewhere, from one country. Who knows, maybe I envy some of you who could proudly claim to be just from one space. This sense of exile is a part of me because of my family's history. I'll share with you now a precious story. We have to be careful with whom we share our precious stories. Any flippant remark following the listening of such stories could make one feel exposed and vulnerable. Academia is where we all wear armors and theorize. We write about the lives of others, which are not ours. Our discipline has not equipped us enough to write about ourselves. Even a tiny morsel of self-reflection that we allow ourselves must be validated through data and evidence to make sense in IR. But you can ask me during Q&A, what does my family has to do with IR? Or you could just be satisfied from accepting that personal is political. My family's personal stories are intertwined with the violence of partition of India and the Mukti Juddho, liberation war, following which Bangladesh became an independent state in 1971. I don't have ownership of either of these stories relevant to global politics if viewed through the lens of mainstream IR. Countless South Asia experts have described 1971 war as the India-Pakistan war, which lasted only 12 days. Before that, there was a 9-month war. Due to the late intervention of India, this is only understood as a war that talks about Kashmir, what was happening in Kashmir, but there's no discussion other than perhaps a footnote that an entirely new state was carved out at that time. Partition in 1947 dispossessed our families and forever separated us, as my mother left their burnt home in Kolkata, India, and crossed the border of a new nation in Barisal, East Pakistan. In 2016, she had to relocate again to another part of the world. But I don't want to burden you so much with these stories of departure. Let's go back to India's partition. Overnight, it changed the naming of our food, our clothes, our culture as Indian. We now eat Indian curries, dance to Indian music, and belong to a country that changed names 3 times and was partitioned by the British colonial power twice, in 1905 and in 1947. We were simply written out of history when the idea of India became the state of India. South Asia experts did not challenge these dominant state-centric narratives. In fact, they championed these and became the primary communicators of such exclusionary framings. These well-known experts were in prestigious South Asian institutes at the University of Chicago, Oxford, Cambridge, and so on. They theorized about South Asian lives without people in these theories. Many of them have done a huge disservice to the discipline of IR by employing the global north framing of what South Asia means without questioning it ever. As such, the study of India tended to colonize South Asia's rich intellectual history. While India constitutes a physical majority of South Asia and embodies the region's collective history, the conflation of the study of India with South Asia and the state-centric approaches muted the narratives that spoke about the bonding of blood, language, traditions, and culture. When I first went to the US in the mid-90s to pursue higher education, I didn't speak up when my professors talked about the war of 1971. I did not mention anything about its people, my people, and the genocide committed in that land, my land. My professor talked about the war in Kashmir, yet also neglected to speak about people from Jammu and Kashmir. So I learned about the macro politics of the war, India, Pakistan, China, the US, and the role of former Soviet Union. I did not speak about the micro narratives of everyday insecurities of people who lived through those wars, including my family. Years later, when I wrote my PhD on war crimes and nation building, drawing on archival material and primary interviews undertaken in the region, I did offer a critique of the narrower framings of the communal violence of the 1947 partition and the genocidal violence of the 1971 war. Yet I left out a major part of the story that mattered to me, the part of the story that I could tell well, and the part that only I could tell in IR, the story of my family. Feminist international relations helped me with crucial methodological tools to speak about margins and marginalization. I explained how, through the symbolic use of women's identities and bodies in national movements, and through the control of their sexuality after the conflict, women become doubly signified by the nation and the patriarchal state. The manipulation of gender relations is a major resource for claims to authority by the political elite who represent the state, in addition to defining the boundaries of the group to which loyalty is demanded. Analysis of gender relations explain, first, the ways in which states or nationalist movements utilize or deploy gender in the making of the nation, which often occurs through obedience and loyalty of its citizens. And second, the ways these processes impact on subaltern groups, including minorities and women. The state becomes the basis of constructing a collective identity, which may be rigorously enforced through schooling, policing, or mass media. Both colonialism and anti-colonial national movements have played their ideological parts in the construction of gender roles. Anti-colonial struggles in many colonized countries have not only rejected the legitimacy of Western rule, but have also often constructed a nationalist political identity by contrasting local culture and values with those of the West. This valorization of the norms and social practices of local culture in colonized territories was often a response to colonial attempts to manage or reshape local norms and social practices, which the colonial powers found unacceptable or inexpedient. In India, in the Greater India, the progressive ways considered sati, widow burning, polygamy, child marriage, and veiling to be significant concerns and moved to frame them as barbaric. Women's oppression by their own communities was also used as a rationale to rule, while local elites reacted by pointing out how culture, community, honor, and norms are shaped by these sacred practices. To whom and for whom did they speak? Indian nationalist men saw their political role as crucially connected to improving the status of Indian women. Anti-colonial struggles in the Indian context, with its unique blend of religious revivalism, targeted women to carry out nationalist projects. These involved drawing women into the anti-imperialist struggles, for instance, addressing public meetings, running schools for girls, fighting for the rights to vote, and so on. However, it simultaneously imposed a new agenda on women as the carriers of tradition, because women's bodies are perceived as weak, soft, and emotional, and in need of regulation, protection, and control. New forms of social disciplining and regulations were required. So while simultaneously constructing women and gender politics, these also constructed important new symbols for the state, namely the spiritual qualities of self-sacrifice, benevolence, devotion, and religiosity. The biological role of women, motherhood, was likewise highlighted in this revivalist project. In this kind of patriarchal hegemony, a woman's sexuality is controlled and disciplined by confining her within the home and interpolating her into familial subject positions as a mother, sister, wife, or a daughter. Now, such interpolations are actually facilitated by the family, the education system, the media, and the religious institutions, and they're endorsed by the state. This sort of patriarchal hegemony was also contested and resisted with new kinds of feminist leaders, such as Begum Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain, the pioneer of Muslim women's awakening in Bengal. She wrote in 1905 this book, Sultana's Dream. And this is a feminist utopia. She wrote this 10 years before American feminist Charlotte Gilman wrote her book, Herland. Now, women are expected to sacrifice for their nation and often are constructed as the symbols of honor and purity, therefore target of an enemy community's rage. Yet, even as victims, women are not able to get away from the blame of impurity and violation. While the perpetrators target them as the other's possession, a woman's own community still tends to hold her responsible. In my research, I narrated the story of how this was evident during the post-partition and post-liberation periods, when rape survivors and abducted women were able to access the state's resources, but only as victims, thus becoming deserving of the state's support. Their agency as individuals, meanwhile, has been largely ignored for the purpose of the grander nation-building project. It was easier to talk about the perpetrators of such large-scale violence and the communities in my book that came out in 2011. Yet I was incapable of articulating the intersectional and ever-evolving nature of the woman question, even within the safe space of feminist IR at that time. I had no vocabulary to express the intersectional vulnerabilities as a person of color in international relations and in the academy. I was moving from contract to contract. I needed a continuing position, and I didn't want to be exposed. I didn't want to be exposed as a vulnerable, emotional human being. My family's stories of war and my everyday struggles as a person of color in Australia all became mangled together. My personal experiences of institutional racism, of trying to get a work permit, a permanent residency visa, and everyday microaggression and prejudice exhausted me. These were my shame, my weaknesses, and they had no space in international relations. My country, my region, they were becoming increasingly authoritarian and militarized. In my adopted land, Australia, I and many others like myself faced casual racism. With its human rights record, prisons full of indigenous inmates, and hostility towards asylum seekers, Australia was increasingly appearing to be as severe as some of the authoritarian states we theorize about. And here in the discipline, we are still theorizing about only regions, Asia Pacific, culture, human rights, yet once perpetuating exclusion in myriad ways that many of my friends and colleagues who have walked in these same paths have pointed out. I relied on feminist networks and was worried about being seen to be explicitly critical of feminist scholarship that created a home for scholars like me. There was a lot of support, love, and positivity. It would have been seen as a betrayal to sisterhood if I offered any pointed criticism. My gratitude as a grad student as an early career researcher to my mentors and friends within the discipline turned into rage and a renewed sense of exclusion. Solidarity mattered. Solidarity matters. This means we have to talk about differences. And these are not private matters, so we must be comfortable talking about differences. These are intellectual conversations that would enrich our discipline. However, our precarious academic positions mean that we are being very careful about what we speak and who we speak to. No one wants to create a problem. So even if I utter that I'm exposing my vulnerability, I hope you hear the word of courage here. That this utterance is an act of courage. That we all have to speak up, and we also have to speak up differently, and we have to accommodate differences. Let me now turn to the second part of my lecture. I see this platform to speak to you as a wonderful opportunity to not only reflect on my personal and professional journey, account for the struggles of navigating a post-colonial identity in colonial white spaces in the global north and exclusions, violence and marginalizations of belonging to the global south, but also to talk to you about the enclosures of a discipline that has both nurtured me and my homelessness, and yet remains steadfastly mainstream, white, exclusionary, colonizing, and appropriating perhaps most critical spaces. Within IR, the word IR theory has a lot of capital. I have always been interested in how the word theory is distributed. Sarah Ahmed talks about citational chain, how that is created around theory. I noticed more and more that I'm being recruited in a space where we do applied research, that is empirical, which seem to be conflated with less theoretical and less philosophical. But empirical world, the world that exists is for me, where the difficulties and challenges reside. It is also a powerful platform for me to speak in a way that does not glorify the global south, where we see class, caste, location, and privileged access created also in global south universities, where IR academics there are very reluctant to speak up. There's a recent example of how IR and sociology academics went to Bhashanchar, which is a tiny island where the Rohingya have been forcibly relocated. Academics there have chosen to be complicit and amplify the state's agenda in the policing of refugees and asylum seekers and women. They also promoted vacuous concepts such as gender equality, but keeping alive the status quo of institutions and scholars as knowledge producers and people as knowledge seekers, recipients. We are often directed to rules, regulations, and traditions to defend colonial and discriminatory practices, notwithstanding that every era has seen its own revolutions and rewriting of rules, determining traditions. In academia, where we imagine an intellectual space of contestations and rule-breaking, unsettling, we have instead created canons, and we are creating new canons, including in critical thinking spaces such as critical race theory and feminist IR. Canons after canons, they preserve colonial and hierarchical practices, and they present the status quo in glowing terms, adapting prevalent vocabularies of the time. This also applies to other knowledge industries we have created, such as in the discussions of human rights, global governance, sexual violence, with scant disregard for the people whose lives we talk about or theorize on. Knowledge everywhere is being produced about people, but those who are actual repositories of knowledge and from them we have cared very little to learn from. And some of them are also indigenous peoples. Katarina Tiwa, my colleague, at the ANU, in her essay, Decolonizing the Pacific, also tells us about pan-Pacific resistance to Euro-American imperial and neocolonial forces. She reminds us that decoloniality beginning with actions, values, stories, and relations, they need to be grounded in kinship, landscapes, seascapes, and skyscapes. Most often, Pacific resistance movements, she tells us, are led by women. They're the keepers of the land and peace. Increasingly, they're also led by youth who are concerned about the environment, such as the multi-sided network of Pacific climate warriors. They have popularized a campaign, "We are not drowning, we are fighting." In the face of rising sea levels and extreme weather events, this constitutes a clear example of both resistance and re-existence. In our book, Cascades of Violence, War, Crimes, and Peace Building in South Asia, this is based on 4,000 interviews in 9 countries, and it took us 9 years to write it. So Professor John Braithwaite and I have argued that in many post-colonial societies, both violent actions and violent imaginaries cascade. Crime cascades to war, war cascades to more war and to crime, and crime and war both cascade to state violence, such as torture, enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial execution. We started this project with one micro case study of the Chittagong Hill Tracks. The Chittagong Hill Tracks was the peace accord, was signed on 2nd December 1997, and it formally marked an end to more than two decades of armed conflict and demands for autonomy by the indigenous people of the CHT. 11 diverse indigenous communities live in this area who are also called hill dwellers. In interviews with the indigenous women leaders who had a reputation for being fierce warriors in the War of the Hills, we asked how they felt that they were not included in the peace negotiations. They half-heartedly remarked that the question didn't take into account that the negotiating table might not always be the most strategic place to be in. One of the terrible features of the 1971 war was the militarization of rape, with the Pakistani military using rape as an intentional tool of warfare. The militarization of rape also cascaded, with 94% of reported rapes of Hill women between 91 to 93 being committed by security personnel. So who hasn't heard the assertion that women must sit at the table? In this sense, the table is a place of influence and power. Critical eye, particularly those focusing on women's participation in peace negotiations, in security discourses, and advocacy campaigns, emphasize that women must have a seat at the table to contribute to meaningful change. The powerful insights from the indigenous women leaders tell us that sometimes tables are not the most strategic place to be. The understanding of meaningful change is different for different kinds of everyday women leaders. Everyday leadership matters as much as institutional leadership, perhaps even more. As a woman, as a professor at the Department of International Relations at one of the top universities of Australia, this also generates some discomfort. Reflecting on my everyday experiences of insecurity in teaching and practicing security, what is clear is that structural measures of inclusion and diversity in the discipline of international relations and security, they depoliticize meaningful and truly transformative inclusion if we only focus on indicators, deliverables, action plans, and outcomes. These make gender hypervisible, rendering race, class, linguistic, and other markers invisible. In this sense, having a seat at the table means nothing, as individuals could still remain powerless in the absence of genuine commitment of others occupying key positions. What I have learned during my transition from an international student to my life as a professor, in one moment, you are not allowed entry because of who you are, because of how you are seen. You are brown, You're a stranger. You could be anybody. In another moment, you are allowed in because of how you are seen. You are a professor. You are brown. You are someone. For some to pass through the door, to enter a room, to have a seat at the table, requires being given permission by those who are holding that door and assume the most powerful seats at the table. Fanon taught us about disorientation, and Sarah Ahmed taught us about how one becomes a question. Whether or not I have been asked a question, I feel questionable. Maybe because I have been questioned too many times, I come to expect it. Where do you come from? Are you really a professor? Really? Trying to embody diversity, I become a performance indicator. Did she really get promoted because she had an exceptional track record? Or is she our diversity hire? Has she been promoted based on diversity? Whenever I enter a room, it is a lot of work for me. Even as a senior member of staff, the emotional labor of making a room your room, of owning the seat, becomes a challenge. In my previous role as the Associate Dean of Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access for the College of Asia and the Pacific at the ANU, I also learned that diversity work is hard work. I learned about different kinds of discriminatory practices within higher education, not only at the ANU, but also in other institutions in Australia and beyond. Both academic and professional staff opened up to me to talk about different kinds of discriminatory practices and systems. I talked to you about the door, the room, and the table. Now let me turn to the walls. Diversity work creates discomfort. It involves creating or raising sore points. In an apparently neutral gathering, you could be the only woman, or you could be the only person of color. And in my case, you could be both. It could become a sore point if you point these differences out, even if you casually whisper it to your friendly colleague next to you. For example, if a committee only includes men, to me, in this sense, color is irrelevant, or if citations in an academic paper are mostly men, a rebuttal often follows that does not take the form of contradiction, but rather an explanation or justification. The response becomes, this was a committee, this was an event, this was a paper, not a structure. It is as if by describing this as a biased structure, you are imposing a structure on it. You become the problem by failing to grasp the heterogeneity of the committee and imposing your own description on something that is fluid. There might be some degree of comfortable complacency from some academics, but diversity work is uncomfortable work. It is meant to unsettle, to disrupt all the pleasantness beneath which anger and grievances reside. The pleasant, happy on the surface self is surrounded by a wall that separates women from men and those of color from others. This we also see in citational practices. Good intentions and bad feelings. Sometimes editors and authors, when we point this out to them, they're very apologetic. Good intentions and bad feelings. They all seem to bind together in a certain way. Citation practices, Sarah Ahmed tells us, are a catering system, justified as a form of reassurance, a way of keeping things familiar for those who want to conserve the familiar. They are a way of keeping acquaintance, a friendship network, a kinship network that reassure those well-positioned within that system that what they reproduce will be reproduced. Due to the nature of my research, I deal with material that includes accounts of violence and in many cases extreme violence. Our social world is also replete with awful stories. I do believe that only empathy and kindness could save us from this collective trauma. We've talked a lot about in OCIS, about methodology. What kind of methodology do we want to employ that allows us to practice empathy and kindness in our research? How does one become a compassionate academic? I've written about this earlier, and Cynthia Enlow reminded us about the politics of care in her lecture. So I leave this to you to ponder. I'm not going to talk about this. These are just some of the things I'm thinking about now in my recent work. I also don't want to really leave you with a pessimistic worldview after all this stock taking. A reality check is necessary from time to time, but it is also important to invest in future pathways. I think in many ways, my life and experiences have taught me to constantly look for survival and solutions because problems never go away. From where I stand, hope makes itself heard, and progressive futures are visible on several forms. See how our community has grown. We have jobs now in feminist IA, critical race theory, in area studies in mainstream IA. In our lifetime, when I started, we had women's studies department, but now mainstream departments in IR and political science are expanding, and they're growing in critical fields. Then think about the mobility of scholars, ideas, and scholarship. These have never been better before, not accounting for the pandemic, but look at the ease with which we are able to access information, scholarship from lesser known worlds. We have resources, funding, and other necessary tools to do good work, to enrich our fields of inquiry. We are increasingly aware that alternatives exist, and we need to tap into resources that have eluded us, mostly due to our own inability to look beyond the fenced terrains of knowledge. I'm not saying that all is good with representation and diversity, but at least we are talking about it. The organizers invited me to deliver a keynote, visibilizing the concerns, hearing the silences, and noticing the gaps are important. I cannot imagine that when I started my career, I would be speaking at events such as this, as in the past, they have been very exclusionary spaces. In a far from perfect world, in a world full of suffering and violence, IR needs to constantly reinvent itself, to remain both relevant and respond to the challenges of the time. The pandemic and last few years of unpredictability and inexplicability in global politics have demonstrated the lack of political purchase and explanatory potential of IR theories. Maybe it is time to invert the gaze further and look at the world from microprisms, from the experiences of people that matter. Not IR telling the stories of people, perhaps people everywhere defining the disciplinary contours and telling the stories through which we can build a world of empathy, care, compassion, and dialogue. We have many challenges ahead, but I'm confident that we have the best researchers and best kinds of methodologies to draw from. We are fully equipped, we are ready. I've almost come to the end of my lecture, but let me take you back to Chittagong Hill Tracks. And here I want to remember Kalpana Chakma. Kalpana was picked up from her home in 1996. And she was an indigenous women's activist. She was only 18 years old. And she now occupies a place beyond a gender space in the society. She was taken by the military, and then she is neither dead, she's neither alive, she's simply missing. Her political activism, personal life, and ultimate disappearances are more than a narrative of just one female political activist. She has now become the face of resistance, not only in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, but globally in indigenous women's activism. I have invited my friend and colleague, Dr. Maria Taniag, to recite what Kalpana had once written in her diary.
When a lone caged bird wants to fly away, does it mean that she longs just for her own freedom? Do those who already know the freedom of the skies have to be caged? If she realizes that she is trapped in this cage, it would be natural for her to express her anger towards those who have confined her. She doesn't belong here. She has every right to reach for the limitless freedom of the skies.
Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Bina. That was a powerful and important closing keynote address. Thank you. I wish this session could continue. It has been wonderful. And I know there are more questions. And again, Bina, we'll have to make sure that you can see all of the wonderful comments. One that's just come in from Katie Brennan at the University of Queensland is, I echo everyone's thanks, Bina. This lecture and the following discussion was insightful and has opened so many new areas of thought for me and given me a lot of things to work on in my scholarship and teaching. Professor D'Costa is one of the most inspiring and exceptional scholars I have the pleasure to know. Her wealth of experience, including that gained by working as a UN staff member, leading large multi-country projects on child protection and forced migration, internal displacement and statelessness in 3 global emergencies, her commitment to creating a better world and also a better academy, and her impressive intellect radiate, I think, from everything that she does. Although your applause isn't audible in this format, I know that you join me in thanking her for a passionate and provocative, insightful and important and brave and bold keynote lecture. Thank you, Bina.
Thank you, Toni. Thank you, Ben. And a big shout out for the Department of IR, I must say.
And now I have the task of bringing OCIS 2020 to a close after 5 full, stimulating, and for me, intellectually challenging, enlightening, and somehow even rejuvenating days. My colleague Evelyn Go remarked while we were planning the conference and making the decision to transform it into an online conference, that it would be something to look forward to at the end of a difficult and even traumatic year. But we weren't sure how it would work if we couldn't meet in person. Of course, we at the Coral Bell School missed physically hosting OCIS 2020 at the ANU, meeting friends and colleagues for meals and drinks, and showing you around Canberra, the ANU campus, and our Headley Bowl Center. But there were silver linings to having an online conference. When we moved it online, I had messages from early career researchers from all over the world asking if they could now register. They hadn't been able to participate before because they didn't have the funds to attend, and now they could. They made the conference more vibrant with their energy and with their ideas, and I'm so glad it was possible for them to join us. I said at the opening session that we had almost 390 people registered for the conference. Well, by the 3rd day, there were 418 people registered and taking part in the conference. An additional 30 people registered after the conference started, who it seems saw tweets about upcoming panels and special sessions and realized there was no barrier to deciding to attend. Personally, I loved having people join conversations from all over the world, and I'm enjoying seeing the IR department file into Bina's office as well. OCIS 2020 was a chance to reflect on the year, on the disciplines and practices that we contribute to, and on every aspect of international politics. And even though we weren't in person, there was a collegiality and warmth and genuine engagement that I don't think I was expecting from an online conference. I hope you'll allow me to pause and thank the many people who made that possible. First, I want to thank my ANU colleagues Evelyn Go and Ben Goldsmith for agreeing to act as deputy conference chairs when I had the crazy idea of putting in a bid to host OCIS 2020 at the Bell School way back in August 2018. They spent an enormous amount of time coordinating the assessment of paper and panel submissions, and then constructing the program and putting panels together, as well as contributing to all other aspects of organizing the conference. I want to thank the OCIS 2020 Organizing Committee, made up of colleagues from every part of the Bell School, as well as other parts of ANU, and representatives from the University of Canberra, UNSW Canberra, and the Australian Institute of International Affairs. We met and planned and organized for over 18 months, yet their enthusiasm never wavered, even when we could no longer meet in person with cakes from my local bakery. They initiated and led a host of great activities, from the new book and paper prizes, the special ECR events, to the screening of a film and a discussion with the filmmaker. Thank you also, and importantly, to the OCIS 2020 sponsors, the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Australian Foreign Affairs, Bristol University Press, China and the World at ANU, Cambridge University Press, the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne, and the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Our sponsors generously honored their early commitment to support the conference, even when it could no longer be held in person. We're incredibly grateful for their support and their faith in us to pull this off. And a very special and heartfelt thanks to the wonderful professional staff at the Bell School for their work and commitment to the conference. Christine Sullivan, Olivia Wenholtz, and Michelle Ferreira were also on the organizing committee and worked behind the scenes from the beginning. These past weeks, Michelle, Tess Harwood, and Kian Kumal spent long days finalizing the program and creating Zoom links. And this week, Michelle also coordinated a team of brilliant supporters. A member of this team sat in each of the 95 panels and special sessions that made up the conference. They've each sat in a room on this floor of the Headley Bull building, where I'm speaking from right now, from 8:30 in the morning until 4:30 p.m. every day of the conference, coordinating and supporting every Zoom session. You will have seen them smiling in the corner of your screen at every panel, anticipating problems, providing information, and coordinating friendly meetings for panelists 20 minutes before each session. This, more than anything, I think, got us past what could have otherwise been inevitable drawbacks and glitches of an online conference. So please, let's thank Michelle Ferreira and her team of Yan Hong Oyan, Mariana Marcano, Tess Harwood, Kian Kumal, Tracy Pilgrim, Tanaj Parak, Victoria Kung, and Sally Cohen. And finally, let me thank you. It could have been easy to give up on a conference that could no longer be held in person at the end of what has really been an exhausting year, but you didn't. Your consistent good humor, patience, and support while we were trying to negotiate changing circumstances this year has really kept us going. And your participation, whether through presenting your own research or being an engaged member of the audience, is what ultimately made it a successful conference. So thank you from all of us at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs. And we look forward to seeing you hopefully somewhere in person at OCIS 2022. Thanks, everyone.